So you want to know how to have perfect cholesterol without using any medications? Well, one little biohack, and I'm being facetious when I say that, one method is to have a very high omega-6/3 ratio, which is something you shouldn't do. But it will give you perfect cholesterol. Let's get into it. I'm going to show you a case study at the end so you'll know what I'm talking about. This is part of 2 videos, which is how to have perfect cholesterol without medications and why you should not do that. So this is the third way. I covered the other 2 big ways to have perfect cholesterol, and wink, wink, nod, nod, by having an omega-6/3 ratio. It's important. And this is actually how most people end up having perfect cholesterol. So we're going to go deeper on omega-6/3 ratio for perfect cholesterol. So this is otherwise known as the Ancel-Keys biohack. I gave it that name. Why are we calling it that? Well, because Ancel-Keys said, you know, our cholesterol is too high back in the day of Eisenhower and so on, where all this got started. Mr. K. Rations himself, he said, we need to get our saturated fats down, which are pretty much animal derived. So let's say eat fewer animal meats, animal parts, animal products, and have more vegetable oil, which are primarily soy and corn oil. There's other forms, but call that omega-6, call that linoleic acid. It's all in there, but they're basically vegetable oils, and that's how they were referred to. And it's not so much that people cooked with them. It's that they are now impregnated into all sorts of commercial foods. They took it out. So all those other things people are eating, that's where they're getting these oils. Not so much that they pour it on their salads and so on, though they probably did that too. So what you see here, I've talked a lot about Ancel-Keys before on another video, which sort of debunks a lot of his work, and the link to that is right above. What's interesting here of what they call is a 7-country study, it's really 26 countries, but he chose 7 to sort of illustrate his story. And regardless of the 26 or the 7, Japan was the lowest. And Japan was the lowest in this context of his data, that they had the lowest omega-6/3 ratio. They had a 4-to-1 ratio. So anyways, his idea was decrease saturated fats, increase polyunsaturated fats, vegetable oil, and your life would be good. Then guess what? What he got right was if you do decrease your saturated fats, your animal fats, it will lower your HDL, which is bad, and your LDL, and your total cholesterol. The second thing he got right was increasing your polyunsaturated fatty acids, your omega-6, your seed oils, if you want to call them that. It also will lower your HDL and LDL and total cholesterol. So he's onto something. So what he said to do would have the effect that he said it would. That's pretty insightful. Actually, he's not a doctor either. But what he got wrong, which is probably the more dangerous thing, was that lowering your cholesterol lowers your risk for heart disease. That was completely false. I don't believe he thought it was false at the time, but it's simply been debunked a long time ago and many, many times since then. And yet, our doctors are still saying, huh, you got to get your cholesterol down. Huh, you're going to die. You know, you're going to have heart disease? Don't want to have heart disease, do you? Just so you don't have to take my word for it, here's some studies from the last 30 years that I pulled out that if you really want to get into it, and this is the first you've heard of it, then you need to know these studies, okay? So let's start 30 years ago. 1994, from Yale University. You know, and it was printed in JAMA. Clearly, JAMA would not be printing this again. So lack of an association between cholesterol and coronary heart disease and morbidity and all-cause mortality in persons older than 70. All right, now we come up 10 years, 2005. High total cholesterol levels in late life is associated with a reduced risk of dementia. We hear so much about dementia now. You know, it's like, so you want to have a reduced risk of dementia, get your cholesterol up. Get your cholesterol up, or be demented. Why would that be? All right, now we go, 6 years later from Japan, it says low cholesterol is associated with mortality from stroke, heart disease, and cancer. That's exactly the opposite that Ancel-Keys was saying. The whole thing that our processed foods are based on, the whole idea of take out the saturated fats, put in the polyunsaturated fats, was completely wrong. All right, now we come up 2018, and this is a really good comprehensive review. So LDL, low density lipoprotein, does not cause cardiovascular disease. A comprehensive review of current literature, international. It's an international group that put this together, 2018. And I know some, I've talked to at least 2 people on that panel. It's phenomenal. So that's really a great one. And yet even more, 2024, this year, is LDL cholesterol associated with long-term mortality? A retrospective cohort study from a large healthcare system. And that was from the United States. Whoa, we're getting some good information, but we had good information 30 years ago. Will that change anything? I don't know. But this is what some studies have shown us, so it's not just me saying this, okay? So what is the point of all this? Point is this. Our ratio should be 1-to-1. That's what it has been ancestrally, but also back at the time of Ansel Keys, when he ran around for those 26 countries. In Crete, which was not part of the 7-country study, they did have a 1-to-1 ratio. Japan had a 4-to-1, and that was used in the study. Okay, so here's Japan at 4-to-1, and here's the omega-6-3 ratio. That's what he's talking about, but just notice on the ratio alone, you bring down the ratio and you head towards a 1-to-1. When people talk about this ratio, they talk about, oh, the industrial world, meaning in the mid-1800s to the present, we don't get better than 3-to-4. That's a reasonable expectation to have. I think you ought to push yourself all the way to 1-to-1. So let's compare all the people that I've taken and put them in 2 groups, right? Non-insulin resistant people who have a HOMA-IR under 1.4, and those that are insulin resistant. That's higher than 1.4 for a HOMA-IR, diabetics and everything else. And so what's the difference that we see between these two? Well, we see that as your ratio gets worse, regardless of your HOMA-IR, is that your cholesterol comes down. So higher omega-6-3 ratio drops your cholesterol for that perfect cholesterol. It drops it faster for non-insulin resistant people, and also for the non-insulin resistant people, their triglycerides do go up, but they don't go up as much. When you match that exactly line by line, you see for insulin resistant people, that seesaw between triglycerides and cholesterol, the triglycerides go up much more and their cholesterol doesn't get as high. Just think of the seesaw. We'll come to that in a second. So here's an example. Here's somebody who came to see me about their PSA being 100, and won't get into that here, but I go through the same sort of basic analysis to find out what's off, what is not fitting into the story here. The first thing I do, one of the first things I do, is that I put this person's cholesterol numbers, right? The total, the LDL, the HDL, and later the triglycerides. I put them into an age match. So I go, all right, let's get out the age calendar that I put together, everybody's data. Where does he fall? But his cholesterol numbers are lower than everybody's average. So he's actually low. His doctor would be proud of him. I'm not proud of him. I'm saying something's off here and something's not right. So his numbers are over here, 221 for total, 151, 50 for triglycerides. So he would have gotten an attaboy. You're doing a great job there, but something's not right. And so I'm saying he has great numbers. Here's his triglyceride HDL, great number. So he'd be passed over. The story is bigger than that. Here's his metabolic numbers, meaning his HOMA-IR is 0.8. We're talking about being under 1.4. He's clearly non-insulin resistant. Here's his glucose. Here's his insulin. Remember, the higher your insulin resistance, your HOMA-IR number, the lower your total cholesterol, all your cholesterol numbers, and the higher your triglycerides. Higher triglycerides with higher HOMA-IR number and lower cholesterol. It sounds like a deal, doesn't it? For that perfect cholesterol. It's definitely not good. Okay, cholesterol, HOMA-IR. Here we go. Putting in actual data. HOMA-IR gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Clearly, they're diabetics out here, but they're having nearly perfect cholesterol. Look how quickly the LDL falls. Look how quickly the total cholesterol falls. And the LDL is like, wow, looks great. They'd have some issues with the LDL, with the HDL, high density lipoprotein, being so low at this point. So your doctor would say, well, I don't know. I like these 2 numbers, but I don't like that one. And here's the obvious. As your HOMA-IR, as your insulin resistance goes up, your triglycerides zoom up. There's such a tight correlation there. Again, the seesaw. Anything that makes your cholesterol low, like HOMA-IR, like your omega-6-3 ratio, like eating a lot of refined carbs, anything that makes your cholesterol low is going to make your triglycerides high. So here's LDL relative to triglycerides. There's the seesaw. They could have done it with the HDL and all the others, but this is pretty straightforward. So he's here. His HOMA-IR is basically less than 1. That's pretty remarkable. A lot of people are pretty healthy. You can sort of see all the dots jammed over there, right? So he's here. Here's his cholesterol, and here's his here's the chart as the HOMA-IR gets worse. So he's here. He should have fairly high lipids, right? His whole panel should be fairly high, and his triglycerides should be pretty low, and they are. Let's break it down a little more though. So here we're looking at his age. Remember we said age, and while he's really too low for non-insulin resistant people, something's odd here. He's not fitting the pattern of his tribe, his metabolic tribe, his non-insulin resistant tribe. He's not fitting that pattern. He's even too low for them. Well, let's compare it to the insulin resistant people. He's too low for them as well, not as much low, because they had lower, remember? They had lower cholesterol panel. So, he doesn't fit either of those. His pattern still does not fit. What's missing? What haven't we identified yet? Any thoughts? His omega panel. His omega-6-3 levels was 11. Specifically, his omega-6-3 ratio. That's the thing that did it. And these are all the components that come with that panel I'm not going to go into, but we're looking at just the 6-3 ratio. Here's his numbers again, 221, 151, 50 for triglycerides. I mean, his doctor would say, you're doing really well. And he's missing the story. The non-insulin resistant versus the insulin resistant 6-3 ratio. Look at this, okay? Here's his 11. He's non-insulin resistant. We put his numbers on that graph and they fit almost perfectly. His 221 lines up basically perfectly, and his LDL perfectly. His HDL perfectly. The only thing that doesn't fit that well, as all the others do, is his triglycerides are actually lower than they should be. His triglycerides should be about 70 or 80, but they're 50. And others would say, you're close enough. You know, it's probably just a good day triglycerides for you, and let's not worry about it. Interesting, but something's off. Let's go further. Notice, by the way, that the triglycerides for the insulin-resistant people are higher than the non-insulin resistant people. That's very key here. Just looking at his panel, we've slapped him into his group of non-insulin resistant people on the omega-6-3 panel, and they all lined up except his triglycerides were off a little bit. It's an amazing match to be that exact. What made the difference is that his omega-6-3 ratio fit nearly perfectly. But here's the last piece to the story. How B12 specific nutrient affects his cholesterol level. We'll be delving into that in future videos and other nutrients. There's just too much for this video. Now let's look at his age versus his folate and B12, right? That's where I start to say, do I see something, a big mismatch? And I have to sort of focus on that. Here's the mismatch. The mismatch is he's very low relative to my pattern for B12. But if you go over to, these are conventional ranges, by the way. If you go over to his folate and B12, his range should be fine. It's roughly 600, it's mid-range. Nobody would look at that otherwise. But if you have a pattern, like any doctor can get, by the way, this is not like exceptional thinking or really clever. This is just doing the work of slapping in the data and looking at it from a spreadsheet to a scatter plot. So you go, that is off significantly for his age group. What are we going to do about it? Well, what will happen, the question is, what will happen when he increases his B12? Does that have anything to do with bringing up his triglycerides, or what is his effect on cholesterol? Here we go. So here's B12 relative to his cholesterol panel, and what do we see? As you increase your B12, your cholesterol, the whole panel increases. The whole panel increases. If he brings it up to what I consider normal, which is around 1,000, which is, according to conventional medicine, kind of at the upper end of normal, it's like, yep, his cholesterol will get higher. So clearly his doctor is not going to be happy, right? We've encouraged him to change his omega-6. That's going to increase his cholesterol. We're encouraging him to have more B12, not a lot, just a little bit. And also obviously to do lab work to make sure he's not overdoing it. That's going to increase his cholesterol. So this is all something his doctor wouldn't recommend. And this is not to slander his doctor. This is to say the data says this, okay? Okay, let's compare him, 71-year-old male, to a 69-year-old female that I've had also pulled from the data. And so what do we find? They're incredibly closely matched. They're really within a year of each other in terms of age. Their omega-6-3 ratio, he had 11. She has 6.7, so far better, kind of half almost. Her cholesterol, total cholesterol is a lot higher. LDL is a lot higher. But they're matched in terms of their HOMA-IR. He's 0.8, she's 0.5. Their trigs HDL, which is another sort of metabolic reference, she's 0.6 and he's 0.8. So they're kind of brother and sister, kind of like in this regard. So what does that mean? Folate, she's a little bit higher in folate, much higher in B12. That could be the problem. Let's compare. Okay, so non-insulin resistant, right? They're both non-insulin resistant, so we're just using that graph. Here's where he was, right? Here's the omega-6-3 ratio. 1-to-1 is your ideal. He's over here at 11. She's at 6.7. What difference does that make? Okay, we go back to a better 6-3 ratio. What do we find? Of course, her numbers, the numbers would be higher. Her numbers fit almost perfectly as well. I did the graph here. You could say that actually her total cholesterol is just a squeak over what the graph would speak to it as saying what is perfect, but it's hard to read a graph that way unless I really pare it back and blow it up. So I'd say she's on the nose for her total, on the nose for LDL, on the nose for her HDL as well. And her triglycerides down here, these are her numbers. Her triglycerides, there should be over here. So she's 53, and here's what that number is. She's almost exactly. So the whole thing lines up for her perfectly. And you go, wow, that's amazing. Whereas he had the triglycerides are off. This is just the same thing for insulin-resistant people. putting both of these together. So his numbers, again, were over here. He had low B12. Now let's slap into her numbers. She's way up here at 2,000. He was roughly 600, right? So we're expecting to see a difference there. So we're going to end with this. For this case, what he needs to do increases B12, his omega-3. But if your goal is to have that perfect cholesterol, what your doctor's trying to get you to have, and I don't know why anymore, at least not over since 30 years ago, since some of these studies started coming out, then what you would do is not pay attention to that. What you would do is be very overweight in terms of fat, not muscle. You would be highly insulin resistant, meaning have a high HOMA-IR number. You would also have a high omega-6 number. You do those three things, you're going to have great cholesterol, I promise. Till next time. So if this is something that you're interested in, that is a topic that I obviously go deeper in terms of labs, in terms of how to do it, in terms of why you would want to do it, various topics that you've seen that I've done in the past, then please let me know below in a comment. Till then.